A major hallmark of a scientific methodology is the use of both written and spoken language to be as precise and concise as possible, so as to avoid unnecessary generalizations and minimize ambiguity. This is why science in general requires complicated terminology, yet clearly defined terminology to be effective, but unfortunately, this complicated terminology can often alienate laypersons and overwhelm them from information overload. The purpose of this series is to find the middle ground between the layperson's prerogative to understand the big ideas and the science advocate's need to be concise in language use. This video in particular will deal with how nuanced biological taxonomy can really be, to contrast with the typical denier's simplistic understanding, especially with the dishonest use of kinds, ultimately to introduce necessary terms when working with cladistics and evolution as a whole. Biological taxonomy is a prime example of a field that depends on the use of our language to illustrate the overall understanding that many other sciences contribute to as a process of unifying a collection of knowledge. In fact, it can be thought that the bigger purpose of taxonomy is to place all of biodiversity into a proper file cabinet based on physical or behavioral characteristics, and the cladistic school of thought in taxonomy places the evolutionary history of organisms as paramount in determining where these organisms ought to fit. Note that I referred to cladistics as a school of thought within taxonomy. There are predominantly three schools of thought in biological taxonomy, differentiated primarily by how important the ancestral history of a species, also known as its phylogeny, is for classification. As we also know, the father of taxonomy as a scientific discipline was a Swedish creationist whose modern legacies were his introduction of the Latin binomial nomenclature system for naming species and the all-familiar ranking system of kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. Of course, Linnaeus died 2 decades before Darwin was even born, so evolutionary thought was not very prevalent, if at all, when Linnaeus founded his ranking system, and as a result, his methodology for placing creatures in his ranked system was often subjective and arbitrary. For example, Linnaeus proposed in his first few editions of Systema Naturae the taxon Anthropomorpha, in which he would include several subcategories of Homo sapiens with other monkeys, in addition to the Central and South American sloths and anteaters. He later retracted this taxon and coined the primate and mammal taxa in its place, but he still contended from the very beginning that humans were indeed part of the animal kingdom, specifically in the same family of apes and other monkeys, despite his creationist beliefs. The majority of Linnaeus' taxonomy of creatures is no longer formally followed in modern times, but a current and similar methodology of placing creatures in groups just based on their overall similarity is called taximetrics, also known as Phenetics. Phenetics involves evaluating all possible points of similarity among a variety of creatures and placing them in groups based on those similarities alone. What characterizes a phenetic approach of classification is the forming of groups with a disregard to the phylogeny of the species considered. This tends to be fairly straightforward, but one of its major downsides is that phonetics is vulnerable to making errors by not making the distinction between convergent traits versus traits directly inherited from a common ancestor. They are assumed to be one and the same, and this can result in misleading conclusions. This approach was ultimately rooted out once the modern synthesis of evolutionary theory was accepted in the scientific community, especially with the discovery and subsequent study of DNA and its inheritance. This isn't to say that phonetics is completely useless, but without making this distinction, phoneticists run the risk of creating groups that don't accurately reflect the genetics of the species involved. An example of a phonetics approach might be if we looked at how the groups mammals, birds, crocodiles, and lizards should be classified based on physical similarities alone. Lizards and crocodiles obviously have more physical traits in common with each other than with birds or mammals, but since birds and mammals are both endotherms, while crocs and lizards are ectotherms, phoneticists might argue to place mammals and birds into a group opposite all ectotherms. As a result of this phonetic method, this would imply that mammals and birds should share some warm-blooded common ancestor separate from the cold-blooded common ancestor of crocodiles and lizards. But if we looked at the genetics taken from representative species of each group, the resulting genetic phylogeny would indicate that birds are actually more genetically related to crocodiles and lizards than to mammals, despite being warm-blooded. Their trait of warm-bloodedness is thus shown to be convergent with warm-blooded mammals, rather than an ancestral trait between them. With examples of taxonomic groups like these showing to be inconsistent with genetic phylogenies that are now able to be found, 2 other taxonomic methodologies sprouted to replace phonetics, and they differ not so much in their conclusions, but in their inherent philosophies. Traditional taxonomy, also called evolutionary systematics, is what we would have if we simply took Linnaeus' ranking system plus the many subdivisions of each ranking and applied the genetics of the representative species to determine which of these ranks are more related to each other than to others, in addition to prioritizing traits according to how important they are to a population. Cladistics, however, is all about simplifying these groups to reflect solely the phylogenies of each taxon, abandoning the ranked system in favor of clades. While cladistics is the most popular in the scientific community today, traditional taxonomy is usually more intuitive for lay people and tends to be easier to communicate. To understand the difference, let's look at the aforementioned example. Now that we are considering the apparent genetic phylogenies of these groups, with birds being closely related first to crocs, then to lizards, then to mammals, a question remains about whether the larger groupings of these creatures should be redefined as a result of this newfound phylogeny. Traditional taxonomists, in keeping with the Linnaean ranking system, would maintain that since birds are not cold-blooded, a diagnostic trait of reptiles, the class Reptilia would still apply to lizards and crocs and still exclude birds, which form a whole other class of organisms, aves, because their being endothermic marks them as quite removed from any typical image of a reptile. Cladists, however, see a discrepancy in this taxonomy, because since genetic phylogenies indicate common ancestry among all of the groups involved, it would not make sense if the common ancestors of a large set of reptiles would eventually give rise to things that would not be reptiles. It would be implying that living things have the capacity to grow out of their ancestry, which is an idea that ironically both creationists and all who accept evolution agree cannot happen. In this case, the taxon Reptilia is an example of a paraphyletic taxon, also called a grade, a group that deliberately excludes one or more in-groups, despite them likely having ancestors that would be part of the parent taxon. Reptilia is therefore paraphyletic in this case because while it includes lizards, crocodiles, and their more basal ancestors and relatives, at some point this tree of ancestry would then imply that there was a warm-blooded bird-like creature that stopped being a reptile. For Cladists, this notion doesn't seem to comply with what we know about speciation, where new species only arise from other species, and thus shouldn't arbitrarily grow out of their ancestry. Cladistic taxonomy should only reflect this. In light of this seemingly absurd discrepancy in some taxonomic arrangements, Cladists insist that all valid taxonomic groups be holophyletic, meaning that it contains an ancestor and all of its apparent descendants without exception, regardless of how drastic the descendants change within that group. This is what defines a clade, and using clades instead of ranks tends to be much more precise in classification and in illustrating evolutionary development. In our example, a cladist may offer instead the holophyletic taxon Diapsida or Sauropsida to include lizards, crocodiles, birds, and all of their common ancestors. Since birds and crocodiles are more related to each other than either are to lizards, more clades are made within Diapsida and Sauropsida, namely Lepidosauria and Archosauria, and this pattern of splitting larger clades into smaller ones is facilitated by noting a tally of ancestral traits called plesiomorphies plus a continuous sequence of derived traits called apomorphies, which eventually lead to what I call the terminal or target group. The product of this tally is a cladogram that can be turned into a phylogenetic tree when set against time. This is basically what I've outlined in the previous entry to this series, where each clade is marked by the emergence of a new trait or set of traits sequentially added to previous trait criteria, and one can see this in action in my Ascertaining Aves from Archosaurus video. Traditional taxonomists, however, insist that paraphyletic groups should be permitted because the terms we use to categorize creatures are intrinsically arbitrary and thus are not always useful. Since a unified label for every group at every level isn't always useful, it's argued that it shouldn't matter what the higher labels are. As long as it is recognized that birds and crocodiles are more closely related to each other than birds are to mammals, why would it matter whether birds are referred to as reptiles or not? This mentality can be further exemplified when we consider the transition from dinosaurs to birds, because traditional taxonomists may likely say that reptilian/ectothermic group Dinosauria doesn't include birds, but that Dinosauria gave rise to non-reptilian endothermic birds, whereas cladists like Aaron Ra, myself, and most of the scientific community would insist that Dinosauria does include birds, especially when it can be argued that the majority of non-avian dinosaurs were transitional between ectothermic and endothermic animals, meaning that if we want to call dinosaurs reptiles, then we must call the bird-like dinosaurs and all of their bird descendants reptiles as well, without making arbitrary exceptions. This is why traditional taxonomists and cladists differ in their philosophies rather than their conclusions. While both acknowledge phylogeny and common ancestry, they oppose fairly well when it comes to actually organizing and expressing the groups they consider. That's why in most Wikipedia articles, groups of creatures are considered both in taxonomic trees and in cladograms when both are available. When it comes to actually communicating evolutionary changes to the general public, however, a taxonomically minded individual may run into frustrations when the people with whom they converse are not as informed about these taxonomic schools of thought. This would result in perceived misunderstandings, where people think you've got it wrong when, given the right amount of time and preparation, you would be all too willing to justify your taxonomic groupings. That is, unless you think that dinosaurs count as dragons.
And they have a skull on display that is clearly a dragon. There's no other way to describe it. It's a dragon skull. It's got horns, like here. It's got a long snout, big pointy teeth. bumps all over its face, bones. So you can imagine that the skin was stretched over this thing. It clearly looks like the dragons of drawings.
That dinosaurs are lizards.
1,000. And yesterday we covered how reptiles grow all their life. Reptiles never stop growing. So dinosaurs were big lizards that lived with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. They did not live millions of years ago.
Or that one group simply can't belong to a higher group for an arbitrary reason.
The kind in Genesis 1 really is more at the family level of classification. For instance, there's one dog kind, there's one cat kind, even though you have different genera, different species.
That's damn near indefensible. A classic example of a reasonable dissent from popular taxonomy is one that Arn Ra had put forward, proposing that humans and other apes, as subsets of the clade Catarrhini, must be properly classified as monkeys because of their shared ancestry with the circipeds and New World monkeys. The argument is that without permitting Hominoidea nor any of its parent clades to be monkeys, the term monkey becomes polyphyletic. A polyphyletic taxon is a group that contains similar creatures based on traits that do not seem to be shared by any of the common ancestors between them. It would be like placing pterosaurs, bats, and flying birds into a group that excludes all other amniotes, including their common ancestors and flightless cousins, just because they can fly. The reason the term monkey is polyphyletic in this case is because despite common ancestry being indicated among all three anthropoid groups, without calling them all monkeys, it would imply that the apes, Old World monkeys, and New World monkeys acquired their monkey-like traits convergently without having some common ancestor that was a monkey itself. This is not only extremely unparsimonious compared to the alternative, but both living forms and fossil evidence yield a progression of monkey-like primates giving rise to ape-like monkeys, then to monkey-like apes, and so if we classify both New World monkeys and Old World monkeys as proper monkeys, then as cladists we must also include all apes as proper monkeys, because if we don't, we then make the monkey term paraphyletic, implying that at some point our monkey-like ape ancestors eventually stop being proper monkeys, and the border between monkey and ape is thus drawn arbitrarily, which taxonomists call admitting paraphyly. Of course, traditional taxonomists may not accept the inclusion of Hominoidea when we use the term monkey, and most of the general public tends to agree with them when they think they are correcting us when we refer to apes as monkeys. Nonetheless, as far as Cladistics is concerned, the only valid groups to be used in taxonomy, and often in everyday speech for some of us, are clades, and in keeping with this methodology, all apes ought to be called monkeys, just as all birds ought to be called dinosaurs, all amniotes-derived amphibians, and, as a more extreme example, all tetrapods ought to be considered terrestrially derived bony fish, because there is no way to reconcile a common ancestry between tetrapods and non-tetrapodal fish without implying that the descendants of fish stop being fish at some point, i.e. admitting paraphyly. However, paraphyletic groups can still have their uses in making comparisons and distinctions, especially when we consider exclusively extinct species that exist in the peripherals of major clades, often called stem groups. Stem groups, by definition, are paraphyletic groups made up of extinct-only species that lie in the transition exclusively between crown groups, which may include the direct ancestors of the crown group. Crown groups are just clades that include the modern living species plus only their most recent common ancestor. Examples of crown groups include Tetrapoda, all least amphibians and amniotes, Amniota, all sauropsids and synapsids, and Mammalia, all monotremes, marsupials, and placental mammals. Some examples of stem groups are thus the stem tetrapods, which are tetrapod-like fish that seem more like tetrapods than fish but are still not quite tetrapods, the stem amniotes, which blur the line between amniotes and amphibians, and the many stem mammal lineages ranging from sphenacodonts like Dimetrodon and cynodonts like Agentotherium, accounting for the massive physical differences between living mammals and living reptiles. Stem groups can be useful for holding extinct species that don't quite fit into the little boxes with taxonomy that most of us apply to living creatures today, but each group needs to have a very clear justification for existing in its place of the tree of life. Otherwise, it may become a wastebasket taxon, a group made solely to accommodate creatures that just don't fit anywhere else. These are naturally rejected in strict cladistics, but they will exist as long as certain species remain elusive to unambiguously classify. It must be said that the fact that so many gradations in the classification system of biodiversity exists is a testament for the nature of evolution being a gradual and steadily incremental ramp of change rather than the distinct steps of a ladder. Many creationists don't understand or accept this, and so are relegated to deciding each creature to be 100% in one distinct box, with no gradations or gradients whatsoever in between boxes, and an example of this black and white thinking is shown here, where several publishing creationists attempted to classify some skull remains of ancient apes, and their answers came out to be strictly either ape, which I'm assuming they mean non-human ape, or human, implicitly defined as a non-ape ape. Most creationists tout that the word kind has a very clear definition.
How do we define kinds, though? I mean, it seems like a really vague term.
Well, it's very, very clear. You've got the canine kind, coyote, and the domestic dog. You've got the feline kind, the cat, and the tiger, and you've got human kind. It's very, very clear.
So if they had such a clear definition, one would think that the decision for classification would be unanimous across the board. Yet, we see here that they clearly didn't agree amongst each other whether each creature was a non-human ape or an actual human, all the while not even suggesting that the creature they're considering might actually have characteristics of both, thus denoting a transitional form. It should be one of the best markers for a creature or a set of creatures to be transitional between groups when creationists themselves can't agree on whether something belongs in one kind or another. Scientists obviously have their disagreements and classifications too, but the difference is that scientists disagree on where to place the transitional species, not whether it's a transitional species at all. Let's further consider this nuance of biological taxonomy versus the mainstay of creationist taxonomy, where their terms and definitions continue to be formally undefined, stealing definitions from actual taxonomy only to say something like,
I think in 99.9% of the cases, it would be obvious to a 5-year-old which animals are the same kind.
This is often followed by the assertion that every creature shown to evolve is of the same kind, in the effort to dismiss offhand all the observations that would be inconsistent with a single creation event.
Science has never found a genuine transitional form that is one kind of animal crossing over into another kind, either living or in the fossil record. And there's supposed to be billions of them.
Mr. Kent Hovind has put forward a sort of litmus test for kinds, which I'll proceed to scrutinize.
Is anybody in here 5 or 6 years old? Who's 5 or 6? How old are you? 6. What's your name? Rachel? Rachel, I want you to take a test here, Rachel. Here we have a dog, a wolf, a coyote, and a banana. Which one is not like the others? The banana. Very good. Let's give her a hand.
One would think that if a functional litmus test for kinds existed, it would have the capacity to be applied to all of biodiversity. Yet Hovind's proposed test for kinds immediately breaks down once we consider creatures that have similarities deeper than that of their relatives in their own respective taxonomic families. YouTuber Potholder54 and Logic handled this rather brilliantly in the videos cited below, but the problem can be illustrated just from a cursory practice of Hovind's proposed 5-year-old test for kinds. So the test requires that a banana be compared to 3 other creatures, and that which is most different from the others positively indicates that the other 3 most similar creatures constitute one kind, a group separate from the last creature which constitutes its own kind. Coupled with the kind designation is also the conclusion that they must share a common ancestor. Since bananas themselves are not organisms but are just the berries of the banana herb, I will be using the banana plant as a standard for comparison instead. At the right level of the Linnaean taxonomic ladder, this test would seem intuitive. Say we take 3 representatives of one Linnaean family, like the Dalmatian, African wild dog, and the red fox. When we compare these to the banana plant, they have obvious similarities that vastly outweighs the similarities they have with these herbaceous plants. And so, by this litmus test, Dalmatians, African wild dogs, and red foxes have a common ancestor by virtue of being the same kind. However, consider sampling creatures that are separated by more than the family rank of taxonomy. What if we looked at the German Shepherd, the giant panda, and the sea otter, and compared them to the banana plant? Well, they still have their similarities like a tetrapodal skeleton, mammary glands, and fur, all of which the plants lack, so therefore they must be of the same kind. We can continue further and compare the German Shepherd with a kangaroo and a platypus. They've got their common characteristics of bearing a tetrapodal skeleton, an amnion, fur, and the ability to secrete milk for their babies. Since banana plants lack all of these, German Shepherds, kangaroos, and platypodes, that's the proper plural form of platypus by the way, since the word platypus is derived from Greek, all must be of the same kind, therefore sharing a common ancestor. This can go on virtually ad infinitum in both directions of more precision or more inclusion, until we actually get to the point where similarities between banana plants and other creatures are actually noticeable. What if we compared banana plants to multicellular fungi, the simplest of animals like sponges, and a typical prokaryote like Streptococcus? At first glance, it may seem like there's nary a similarity to be had among any of these creatures, but we know that multicellular fungi and sponges both possess flagellated cells, when banana plants do not, yet banana plants, fungi, and sponges all have nucleated cells, in addition to all three being multicellular themselves, which neither can be said for Streptococcus or any other prokaryote. So what happens here? We've laid out the similar characteristics that are shared among these creatures, yet this test might have us believe that since there are three creatures that share more similarities with each other than with the last creature, they must therefore be of the same kind, and therefore have a common ancestor. This is the consequence of proposing a litmus test for kinds that I'd imagine Mr. Hoven did not think through properly. The other problem with this test comes up when we go in the opposite direction. It's an obvious trend that the more traits three creatures have with each other, or put in another way, the more differently they are to banana plants, the more likely it is that they are of the same kind and must therefore share a common ancestor. Consider comparing banana plants to the ring-tailed lemur, the pygmy tarsier, and the golden snub-nosed monkey. The lemur, tarsier, and monkey are all primates when banana plants are not, so they must be of the same kind, therefore common ancestor. The snub-nosed monkey, colobus monkey, and the olive baboon are all anthropoids when banana plants are not, so same kind, common ancestor. The colobus monkey, olive baboons, and siamang are all old world monkeys when banana plants are not, ergo same kind and common ancestor. Siamangs, crested gibbons, and orangutans are all apes when banana plants are not, ergo same kind and common ancestor. The orangutans, gorillas, and chimps are all great apes when banana plants are not, ergo same kind and common ancestor. And finally, chimps, Australopithecines, and humans are all hominines when banana plants are not, ergo same kind and common ancestor. Here's where the big problem usually comes in, because I've been following exactly the same pattern in all of my attempts in using this test for kinds, yet I've come to exactly the same conclusion as any real method of classification has given. How interesting. One should also notice how the cladistic concept of holophily emerges simply as a result of continually splitting groups into smaller and more exclusive groups, without letting any in-groups be excluded from its parent group for any reason. This is why any strain of characteristics requires every creature that has those characteristics to be incorrigibly bounded by the label or labels used to designate that particular strain of characteristics, regardless of how unintuitive it may seem. And yet, some continue to say that birds aren't dinosaurs, humans aren't apes or even animals, and that this overall pattern of nested hierarchies does not and cannot apply to the whole of life for reasons unknown. So it should be clear at this point that inconsistencies of creationist taxonomy become glaringly obvious just based on the fact that their use of kind remains elusive to unambiguously define, with definitions ranging all the way through the Linnaean ranking system, as illustrated by the failure of Mr. Hoven's proposed litmus test for kinds designed for 5-year-olds. Recently, however, I've been exposed to the creationist attempt of stealing more from scientific taxonomy through their attempt at their version of cladistics to actually define what these creative kinds would be, a proposed field known as baraminology. It really deserves its own video to explain its shortcomings, but suffice it to say here that their attempts at cladistics are blatantly used with double standards for select groups of creatures, namely ourselves, stealing cladistic terminology like holobaramin and polybaramin, only to achieve nothing substantial in the end. This is just another example of dishonesty creationists must defer to in order to defend their own position. So in this second part of Cladistics Made Easy, I have attempted to illustrate the inherent nuance in biological taxonomy by introducing schools of thought that allow one to understand the complex terminology that characterizes taxonomy. Understanding how classification works is crucial to understanding the evolution of living things, a field of knowledge that not only helps unify the whole of biology, but also provides an avenue for denialists to show just how far they will go to dishonestly deny facts of life.